Welcome to Workplace Psychology with Dr. Martha Grajdek. I'm Dr. Martha Grajdek. This podcast examines a wide variety of work-related issues through the lens of industrial and organizational psychology. And while many of the topics discussed here may be seen as intended for white-collar employees and their employers, in reality, the ideas presented here are applicable across organizations and industries. Additionally, many of the topics discussed here may be applicable outside of the workplace. I encourage you to examine what's presented here, apply what makes sense to you, and simply discard the rest. In today's world of never-ending technological advances and flexible work modalities, tracking one's time and work has become a norm for many organizations. Whether an employee is working on-site or remotely, or some combination of those two, many companies choose to track the employee's movements throughout their workday. And although many companies choose to engage in this kind of activity, this kind of monitoring, far too often employers fail to realize that time tracking and monitoring tools can have a significant impact on the employee and their productivity. On one hand, time tracking and monitoring tools can absolutely destroy trust. It can be seen as a form of surveillance or policing. On the other hand, this is something that can create clarity. It all depends on how and why this monitoring is put into place. The design can make or break the experiment. When it comes to monitoring one's employees, especially when using technologically advanced tools, trust is a big part of the employee-employer partnership. It has to be a balanced equation. And although today we focus mostly on timekeeping and monitoring that utilizes technology, this is just as important if timekeeping and monitoring happens solely in person by an individual who oversees one's activity and productivity throughout the day. So whether that's a tracking tool of some sort where technology is used or the prying eyes of a manager, at the end of the day, time tracking and monitoring is the same thing regardless of how it is accomplished. It is in everyone's best interest for trust to be high on the list. In order for trust to be present, we need transparency, consent, and the perception of fairness in monitoring or measurements. As soon as the employer tracks or monitors the employee without consent, without transparency, and without clarity, trust can become an issue. Unfortunately, many companies choose to utilize tools that allow tracking of employees quietly behind the scenes without the employee ever knowing that this is happening. The message that this kind of behavior sends can be absolutely detrimental and indeed quite destructive. The message that this sends is that the employer does not trust the employee and feels that it is right to be secretive or underhanded in monitoring the employee, their activities, and their progress. It's no secret that the best kind of relationships, the most productive kind of relationships, that includes the employee-employer relationships, must include trust and respect. When monitoring and surveillance is happening without transparency or consent, that activity, that kind of behavior on the employer's part sends a negative message to its workforce. Besides transparency and consent and fairness or perceived fairness, it's important that the right things be tracked. What is tracked can absolutely affect that trust and either add to the level of trust or completely destroy it. It's one thing to track outcomes and things such as flow metrics. Those can be beneficial. Those pieces of information can lend themselves to learning opportunities and improvement for both company and employee. Focusing on things that will allow both the employer and the employee to become stronger, more successful, and more productive is key. On the other hand, monitoring things such as keystrokes and taking screenshots is not only unproductive, but can come across as sneaky and underhanded. The message there can be that the employer is simply looking for an opportunity to catch the employee in the act of doing something wrong. That kind of relationship clearly lacks trust and respect. Of course, all of this is very different from specific situations where an employer may have a valid suspicion of something wrong happening with a particular employee. That's a different conversation altogether and should probably include the corporation's legal team. What's being discussed in this episode specifically is simply the general idea of timekeeping and monitoring employees by the employer. This brings me to another point, and that pertains to perceived fairness. Not only is it important to monitor or measure things that need to be measured or are beneficial to measure, but also who is monitored and whose work is measured matters. It's important that companies do not single out individuals or departments, but rather include everyone in these monitoring practices. The big takeaway here, the big idea is that if a company is going to collect information, collect data by keeping track and by monitoring their employees, that data should be able to be used for some kind of learning and improvement, both for the organization and its workforce. Watching people just to watch them is very unproductive. Monitoring people in hopes of catching them doing something wrong is toxic. Since time tracking and monitoring employees should be something that's consensual and transparent, it should then lead to constructive conversations, to productive talking points. These conversations, these talking points should most definitely lead to improvement. That should be the main goal. And these conversations can be happening amongst management, but also absolutely must be happening between management and non-management employees. And it must be a true conversation. It should not be something where management is simply talking at or preaching to employees. Employees have valuable feedback and input that should be collected and utilized in any kind of changes and improvement moving forward. It's one thing to make decisions based on collecting data regarding someone's performance, but a better approach is to add to that the feedback of those doing the work, those in the proverbial trenches. timekeeping and monitoring practices must have policies in place. These policies should be updated and altered as information is learned and improvements can be made to both policies and practices. Policies should not be written in stone, especially when it comes to timekeeping or monitoring of employees. When crafting policies, first and foremost, purpose must be identified and well defined. What is the purpose of gathering this data, of keeping track of employees? Besides a purpose statement, policies should contain very well-defined specific rules regarding access. How will this information be gathered, and how will it be accessed after it has been collected? For example, who has access to it? Who is able to look at this information, and for what purpose? Another thing to consider is how long will this information be kept? How will it be stored? And of course, an appeal process must be well defined in any policy that pertains to monitoring employees. An employee absolutely must have a clear path to providing their own feedback or explanation for anything that was gathered by the employer. And of course, while some companies may simply state that it is their right to collect data, to monitor their employees, and to keep track of them without any kind of permission, transparency, or explanation, the reality of the employee-employer relationship is such that it is much better to have a consensual gathering of such data, consensual monitoring of one's activities and performance. As I mentioned earlier in this episode, it's all about the trust and the quality of the relationship between employee and employer. Since those in management will likely be involved in either gathering the data and or in interpreting the data, the information that has been collected, it's critical that organizations provide proper training for managers on how to conduct themselves during the entire process, from gathering information to interpreting information and discussing it with employees. It's critical that managers understand that collecting this data is first and foremost intended for balancing workload and coaching opportunities. It should be about learning and growth for both the employee and the employer. This is about open conversations and feedback opportunities from both employer to employee and employee to employer. It should never be used as a form of punishment or as a way of policing the workforce. It is critical that management embrace learning and balance rather than suspicion, mistrust, or punishment. I cannot stress this point enough. Proper training of those in management positions is critical. The stark reality of management is that not enough training is given to managers, which can very easily lead to the abuse of power. A good place to start is to create a document representing a humane timekeeping standard for the organization. This would be a good starting point for creating or updating or revising current policy. It can be a simple 2-page document. It doesn't have to be longer, especially when just starting out with creating this official policy. Remember to review it with your team before it's rolled out to the organization. As this episode comes to an end, let's review what was discussed. As more organizations embrace the use of technology, they also may choose to incorporate technologies that focus on timekeeping and monitoring of each employee. It is absolutely critical that the reason and the method of monitoring is chosen and executed very carefully. It's entirely too easy for employee monitoring to turn into a detrimental experience for everyone involved. It should be used for creating clarity, growth opportunities, and advancements. But when done in the wrong way, it can absolutely destroy trust. Purpose and policies are key, as is transparency and perceived fairness. And while some companies may feel entitled to collect data and monitor their employees without disclosing such activities, the bottom line is the quality of relationship and the strength of trust that exists between employee and employer. A good company will focus on humane timekeeping practices, where everyone involved can learn and grow rather than trying to catch employees in some kind of wrongdoing practices. It's critical that policies be in place. Purpose, rules, and an appeal process should always be part of a well-written policy. Remember that policy should not be written in stone, but rather be one that grows and evolves with time as needed. Management must get proper training regarding employee monitoring. Management's focus must be on workload balance and growth. Learning opportunities and open conversations must be key here. Employee monitoring should never be used for policing and punishment purposes. And lastly, remember that a simple 2-page document pertaining to the Humane Timekeeping standards can give you a good start in crafting your company's policy on timekeeping and monitoring your employees. As the week unfolds, I encourage everyone, whether you are in a management position or not, to consider what kind of timekeeping and employee monitoring practices exist within your organization. Take this opportunity to offer feedback or start conversations about these practices and consider how you may bring improvement into the experience so that everyone benefits as a result. For those of you who experience this podcast in an audio-only version, I encourage you to check out my YouTube channel, Stress Free with Dr. G, where you can find the video version of the podcast. Once you're there, check out some of the other videos. They focus on stress management. Stress Free with Dr. G, as I said, is available on YouTube, and the link for that is in the description below. Thank you for joining me today. Please subscribe to this podcast. I look forward to seeing you here again next time. Until then, I wish you joy and well-being.